are Hans-Martin Friesel and Julia Bergmans, and today we are discussing European climate risks. In fact, today we also launched the full report, the final report, and we will share the link with you below in the comment section once we get our discussion going today. But we are going to discuss climate risks and the findings of this very interesting report, which has gotten a lot of attention around Europe and the world since it was launched a few weeks ago. Before we get to the questions, I'd also ask our viewers, if you have any questions or comments for our experts here today, please jot them down in the comment section and we'll make sure to get those questions to the experts to answer them for you today. So, a big topic, quite an interesting report, quite a revealing report for all of Europe. There's been a lot of anticipation about this report coming in, and a lot of attention from policymakers, MEPs, and governments on this report. What are the key conclusions of the report, first of all?
Yeah, thank you. The climate in Europe and globally has been breaking records year after year, and recently even month after month. And these are not the records that we would like to see broken. So it is now clear to every citizen that human-caused climate change is not a hypothetical scenario for the future. It is happening here and now. So climate change is affecting all of us, although not in the same way. And against the background of this increasingly rapid climate change, the new EEA report has assessed a number of things. So first, how climate change is already affecting Europe now. Second, how the risks of climate change would further increase in the future unless decisive policy action is taken. And finally, which risks require particularly urgent action. And in our report, we identify 36 major climate risks for Europe, grouped into 5 clusters. So we look at ecosystems, at food, at human health, buildings and infrastructure, and economy and finance. And our assessment pays particular attention to the long time horizons required for reducing many of these risks, because delaying action can become very, very costly.
Quite serious conclusions. So the report calls for action in many areas, which are the most urgent?
Well, indeed, the report calls for 36 risks. More than half of those actually need action now. And of those, there are 8 risks that need urgent action now. And those risks, they include risks to coastal and marine ecosystems. They include the risk to heat stress for the population. Also the risks of flooding, the risks to our European solidarity mechanisms. And then for Southern Europe in particular, there are risks to from wildfires, there is a risk to crop production, and there is a risk to biodiversity and carbon sinks. Now, in our report, while we don't really assess the actions, we mostly point out the problems of the risks. But what I can say is that the actions that we assess, or we can say that the actions to address the risks, they are not effective. They are not effective because climate risks are increasing with a fast pace, and this is not up to the speed of the implementation of the policies. The risk ownership is unclear for to manage the risks, and the objectives of the different policies that have to address the risks, they are also unclear. Then many of the risks, they need coordination across different governance levels, which is often not the case. And finally, the risks need implementation at the national level, at the local level, and this implementation is lagging behind. Now, since the report does not cover explicitly the actions, it does cover some examples. One example of these actions is urban planning. So we see that cities become unlivable because of heat stress, and this heat stress is one of the major risks that we have identified in UCRA. And we evaluate that policies need to improve the building standards in the cities, the spatial planning in cities, to be able to reduce the heat impacts to human health.
So, I mean, the heat stress, for example, in cities, I mean, is it because the way we build the cities that it's becoming more vulnerable to these risks?
Indeed, it's because of the way we build cities, because of the legacy of old cities, because also many vulnerable groups live in cities. And especially vulnerable groups are at risk of climate change.
Yeah. Okay. Again, if you have any comments or questions for our experts today, please jot them down in the comment section and we'll make sure to get them to our experts. Another question I think that's on all of our minds, and I think it was also echoed by a lot of politicians and policymakers, is why should we be so concerned about the findings?
Well, as my colleague just explained, we assessed 36 climate risks, and many of them are at critical levels already now, and almost all of them could reach critical or even catastrophic levels throughout the century without decisive action. So we need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions globally, but we also need to prepare for the unavoidable risks. Maybe some examples. In the summer of 2022, just 2 years ago, about 70,000 people in Europe died prematurely as a result of excessive heat. And this number could increase to hundreds of thousands per year throughout the century without further action. Or if we're looking at floods, the floods in Slovenia last August created damages of about 10 billion euro. And just for perspective, this is about 1/6 of the annual economic productivity, the annual economic output of the country, lost in a single day, more or less. So without further action to slow down climate change and protect our settlements and infrastructure, those damages would further increase, and in the long term, in particular, coastal floods are a very critical risk. Without action, the cost could exceed 1 trillion euro per year at the end of the century. So, I mean, maybe to sum it up, if we do not consider climate change in our current decisions, we may leave our children a world where critical infrastructure is placed in floodplains, where dwellings become heat traps in increasingly hot summers, where forests cannot withstand increasing fire danger or insect pests, and where climate impacts outside Europe threaten our well-being and our security.
Yeah, it's quite serious stuff. Perhaps we could talk a bit about the report and the research itself at this point. How's the report been put together? And tell us a bit about the research and that underpins the report.
Yeah, a good point. So the report has been written by 96 authors. They are based in research institutes, in academia, in international organizations, and so on. Also, during the process of the report, of the drafting of the findings, we had strong involvement and strong input from experts and from stakeholders. They have been involved from the scoping of the report until the finalization. And also the report has been built on existing knowledge mainly, so we are not necessarily presenting new evidence. And this existing knowledge is based on qualitative and quantitative sources. They come from data and reports from the Copernicus Climate Change Service, from IPCC reports, from EEA products as well, but also reports and findings from Horizon 2020 projects or any other, also many other products from the European Commission, and so on. This is just to name a few.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but it's mostly European researchers, or you mentioned international aspects as well.
Indeed, IPCC is international, of course. There are indeed many of the European products involved here as basis for the knowledge.
Yeah. So just to get a scale of this research project, has any other region in the world, country, done something like this?
Well, I mean, Europe is standing out in terms of having organizations spanning almost the whole continent. There is, for instance, the regular US national climate assessments, which draw actually on even wider research bases. That's a process that has been established for many years. But in terms of transnational organizations, I'm not aware of anyone having done something like this, except, of course, IPCC, but that's not quite as comprehensive if you look at specific regions or countries. Okay,
it's good to know. Before we get to, we're getting some questions in already, I just wanted to highlight the data viewers that were also launched today. Could you explain a little bit about how they work and what they offer to users?
I'm happy to take that question indeed. So we have published 2 dashboards. We call them interactive viewers. They are a way to enhance the data and the functionalities of what is presented in the report. So a user can go and explore the risks that we have identified and find all the relevant information to those risks, but also to the drivers of risks. We have also a dashboard that is presenting the information on the drivers and how it is evolving through time and in different scenarios of the future. So that is a way to indeed show the users how this information from the data can be more interactively used and explored.
Yeah, and we'll put the link in the comment section below so you can have a look for yourself more about the report, not just the press release, but the full report, which is now available as of today, and the data viewers and all further related information there for you at your fingertips. We have a question from Filippini in Italy. In Italy, the Macerata floods heavily damaged medieval structures. Are we aware of how fast things are worsening? Have we learned lessons from disasters in comparable realities?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and indeed this is one of the regions that has been affected by very strong floods in recent years. I mean, one has to emphasize that, of course, floods are partly a natural phenomenon, and not each and every flood is directly linked to climate change, even though the projections are increasing for most European regions. So maybe there's a start. And it is indeed very important to focus on building back better after a catastrophic event. I think so far the only evidence I'm aware of that after a major flood things have improved is related to the Elbe River, where there was a very large flood around 20 years ago and then another one around 10 years ago, and they were broadly comparable, but the damages 10 years later were much less. So learning is happening, but there may also be cases where this is not the case.
I guess it's a question of adaptation. Obviously, you learn to adapt, and so we must be learning something over the last 10 years. That green spaces work, blue spaces work, not only for reducing heat, for instance, but also improving the well-being of the people living in these areas. Yeah. Perhaps also, I mean, we mentioned in the report that Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world. Can you explain a bit about that?
I'm happy to explain you why this is so. Europe is lying close to the Arctic region, and the Arctic region is warming the fastest actually in the world. So if Arctic would be a continent, it would be the Arctic warming the fastest. So this is one reason of Europe warming faster than the globe, and also because in Europe we are exposed to blockings, which is a phenomenon in the atmosphere caused by the jet stream that is slowing down, and this is causing blockings in summer, which is causing a lot of intense and frequent heat waves, and this also causes it contributes to the extreme warming compared to the globe.
Okay. Yeah, I know we're having some technical difficulties, but I think we're all back now online. So if you have any questions or comments, please jot them down, and we'll get them to our experts during our discussion here today. We have a question from Elena. What is the most urgent climate risk concerning Europe? What's the most urgent one of the 36 or more?
I mean, that is, as explained, we have identified 8 as particularly urgent. And I mean, it's hard to put lives before euros or the other way around. We're no longer in the situation where we have the luxury to just concentrate on one risk. So, of course, if you're in the health sector, the most urgent one would be to focus on heat. But at the same time, we see that ecosystems, both marine, terrestrial, and freshwater ecosystems, are very strongly affected by climate change in combination with other stressors. So it would not be fair to say let's just concentrate on one and ignore the others. We're no longer there.
What do you think is the most surprising for people, the risks you think are the least known to people amongst the risks?
I would say from my point of view, what is the most surprising is not necessarily the risk itself, but the fact that the risks, they cascade. And so risks, if they are infecting a specific sector or a system, they can cascade another sector or system.
Yeah.
So in the case of a mega drought, it can impact our crop production, but it can also impact wildfires, which can impact human health, which can impact infrastructure, it can impact our economy and finance, and in the end it can impact the whole society.
Yeah.
And that is for me the most interesting fact about assessing these risks. So not necessarily this one risk, but this combination of cascading.
Yeah, it's interesting because people they find a little bit abstract. Of course, we feel the heat and the drought in our backyards or whatever and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of anxiety building about these things, and that governments need to do more about this stuff. And perhaps the next question is, what next? What's being done with this report?
Now that's of course a very relevant question. We don't do the report just to share the knowledge. We would like to see action. And over the last couple of weeks since we published, let's say, the preliminary version, we've discussed the findings of the report with many different stakeholders across Europe, and we will continue doing this in the coming weeks and months. The European Commission has already published a plan, they call it a communication, that responds to our assessment, but more concrete action needs to follow up after the elections to the European Parliament, which are, of course, coming up next week. And hopefully we will see a strong political mandate to act on climate change after those elections. We're also in dialogue with many national policymakers, central banks and others on how they could improve consideration of climate risks in their work. And I think it's really encouraging to see the large attention that our report has created and how many people actually ask in different contexts and meetings, so what does climate change mean for me and my work? What can I do or what can we do? So right now we are focusing on sharing and discussing the results of the European Climate Risk Assessment with those expected on it. But of course, we're also starting reflections on whether there will be a follow-up report and how that could look. I mean, at the moment, it's a bit too early to say that. It depends on the demands of the European policymakers, but I think it's fair to say, I mean, we have the impression that there is indeed a large interest and a demand for a follow-up report. But then further discussion is required regarding the timing, the scope, the resources, and those aspects.
Great. We're getting lots of questions in, so thank you for your attention and for your interest. Please keep them coming. Next question from Shaima. How do you evaluate the current climate risks related to the Danube River? Perhaps we can't talk too specifically about that example, but if you have any information to share on that.
The Danube River is, of course, it's exposed to risks as river flooding. It's close to areas that are also exposed to heat stress. So I would look more into the risks that are relevant for this area. And it's also relevant for the ecosystems that are dependent on the Danube River. So in that sense, those risks are relevant for this area. Maybe you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, maybe also to say that this is the first European climate risk assessment that was done, let's say, with limited time available. So we're not going into very specific risks for I mean, Danube is the longest river in Europe, so I don't want to downplay it, but we're not looking at specific individual countries or rivers this time around. That is something to reflect for the future. Maybe to highlight that we have even though we are not doing a fully disaggregated assessment, we have identified a number of hotspot regions. And here, Southern Europe is one of them, where there are multiple climate risks that are particularly strong. I mean, obviously, mostly those related to heat and drought and wildfires, all that. Also, low-lying coastal regions are affected in many ways by sea level rise, an increasingly important risk. And also the EU outermost regions. These are those little relatively little islands and territories outside mainland Europe, they're also at particular risk.
Yeah, and perhaps for rivers in general, I mean, there are the floodplains related to those, right? So I guess that's a general problem or challenge or risk in all of Europe, including the Rhine River and Elbe and so forth, that we've seen recent tragic examples of in flooding and so forth.
And maybe that's actually a good example, since you mentioned the Rhine and you've just talked about cascading risks. I mean, the Rhine has multiple functionalities, and in particular for Germany, it is a major transport route also. And we have seen a number of droughts where this where river transport was strongly impaired because the water levels were too low, of course with quite significant costs for the industries and businesses located in this region.
Next question from Vlatko is an interesting question. I was going to get to it, but what we can do as people to help, obviously, I mean, a lot of action is needed at all levels, but also as citizens, as individuals, what can we do? And here from Vlatko here, there is a tendency to use the term climate change for everything bad that is happening around us, which gives an argument to policymakers for inaction. What are the actions that everyday people can do to recognize what is climate related and what is not?
That's a very good question. So we are individuals, we are also citizens, so we can do as much as we can. So for example, we can take decisions that can protect our households, that can protect our houses. So we can take decisions at our level of interest. We can get informed about what our governments are doing, what our local governments are doing to protect us from the risks. For example, what they do to protect us from flood risks. Or if we live in cities, what they are doing to protect us from the heat waves. Just also get informed about how they are building the new green and blue spaces in our cities. But what we also can do as individuals is help promote those actions that governments are taking, and also volunteer maybe in this type of actions. And also, it's not only about adaptation, of course, it goes hand in hand with reducing our emissions. So we need to still remember ourselves that we need to reduce our emissions. We can do this by just taking more sustainable modes of transport, eating more plant-based, this type of actions.
Another question from Rosano. Do you think we started to accelerate the process of adaptation and mitigation here in Europe? Something positive, please. She's looking for positive news.
Yeah, no, there are definitely also positive news. I mean, where countries are reporting to us every other year on their plans, on their actions. And all countries in Europe by now have national adaptation policies. They have underlying risk assessments. I think around half of them have updated those risk assessments just in the last 3 years. So action is definitely happening. So at the European level, that there are larger programs such as the so-called Mission on Adaptation. Now we see that planning is happening everywhere, whereas implementation is still lagging behind a bit. There's a lot of pilot projects and we are promoting and sharing the information on Climate Adapt. But transformational adaptation happens only to a limited degree, and often actually only after a severe event happened. We see this even in Copenhagen, where there was a very severe flood called like the 1 in 1,000 year flood in 2011, and then politicians really picked it up to make sure that another extreme rain like this would not lead to the same amount of flooding. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, I would say. But once again, it's really encouraging after the publication of this report how many policymakers outside the environmental bubble are interested and are following up.
Yeah, again, we're running out of time, but if you do have comments or questions, get them in now, and then we'll make sure we'll sneak them in for the experts. Follow-up from Vlatko. To clarify his question, how is it assessed what extreme weather is and how it's related to climate change?
Well, that's a very good question. So we use climate models. With climate models, we assess the future climate by looking at scenarios. Those scenarios, they give us an idea of how climate would look like in the future. And we have several indicators to indicate what is extreme weather. For example, heavy precipitation is defined as a way, as a day or as the number of days that extreme that precipitation is above a certain threshold. So we have specific indicators. Or for example, heat wave days are defined as a way, as a day that is above a temperature of maximum temperature of 35 degrees. So we have these indicators to define what is extreme weather, and then we look into these scenarios.
Okay. Again, we have the data viewers available to you here. Again, if you still have a question or comment, you can still get it in, and we'll start to wrap up now. But if you do have a question, now's your time.
Maybe I could even follow up on this if there are no other questions.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a very interesting research field that has developed over the last 10 years or so, which is called climate attribution studies, and which looks specifically at these questions, I think by Vlatko, on the links between extreme events and climate change. I mean, what we see is always a combination of natural climate variability and an increasing climate change trend. So there are many studies also for Europe which link specific heat waves or floods to climate change and see how much more likely or how much more severe would that have become due to human-made climate change. So the overall trend is clear. Now if we look at the risk management, those so-called attribution studies are maybe not the main drivers for policies, because if houses get flooded, or if people are dying during heat waves, or if crops are withering, it's actually not so important for the decision makers whether the climate change contribution to it was 80% or 60% or 40%.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to act to protect our health, our economies, and our social well-being.
I think,
and to build further on that, even some of the climate risks are in fact a combination of climate change drivers and other drivers, like socioeconomic changes, like aging population, like poor infrastructure, and those actually work together. And some climate risks that we have identified are not even the result of a majority climate change. They are mostly the result of socioeconomic conditions that change and that get more severe that can then impact the climate risks.
Just before I ask you one last question, both of you, just to alert the viewers that we have a lot of reports recently on climate change adaptation and mitigation. So check it out on our website on recent reports on city adaptation, some good examples of positive solutions, as well as climate-related health risks due to floods, droughts, and water quality, which is also available on our website. And perhaps a last question to you both. What lasting impression has working on UCRA given to you? I mean, do you think we're on the right path here moving forward?
I think it has received huge interest at a level where the interest should happen. So from my point of view, it's a very good uptake, and I'm sure this will have a continuation.
Yeah, not much to add. It was very hard work, exciting, of course sometimes also challenging, but the uptake so far has been great, and of course we will be following up and further discuss the findings with many stakeholders. Great.
Thank you for your time today, and thank you to the viewers as well for taking the time and the interest in our European Climate Risks Report. Again, as I said, is available via the links in the comment section. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.